So listen, I want to unpick some of the things that you've learned and you've written about over some of those years in two or three subjects, and then we'll see where we get time to in this session to talk about something else. But I suppose we should start with the thing that perhaps you said that you've researched, and the thing that perhaps people think about you of the most in one sense, David. So that's Recovery Capital, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
And tell us something what you've learnt about that, and before we get into talking a little bit more about the recovery communities or the recovery organisations and stuff, because that's been at the heart of what you've done. And I've always been conscious. Every time I need to think about you, all I ever do is think about you giving chats involving a box with donuts, so
Yeah.
So the contagion effect, I think, is part of all of that, yes?
And one of my main Australian developments was around that social identity model and social theory. And I would still regard myself kind of at heart as a social psychologist.
Okay.
I'm not sure social psychology would have me, but I'm self in that. And it's funny because two things really fundamentally happened when I moved to Australia. One, I got absolutely savaged by Alex Wodak and the harm reductionists in Australia as the carrier of an evil disease of recovery that wasn't wanted or welcome in Australia. And it wasn't my experience on the ground, but nonetheless, among the cognoscenti of the Australian addictions field, I was a dangerous outsider carrying an evil message. And, they were full of those traditional criticisms, which, in retrospect, had some weight about it's all personal narrative, wishful thinking, God, spirituality. Provide me with meaningful evidence of what's going on in the recovery world. And, I thought we could do some of that, and certainly some of the work that, say, Leanne Kaskutis has done in 12-Step, and you mentioned Rowdy earlier, him and Wouter have done, along with George de Leon and Therapeutic Communities. There are... But they're all indicative little bits of evidence. John Kelly's and Keith Humphrey's phenomenal work on reanalysis of Project Match. They all look good, but they were patchy. And you could totally drive a horse and cart through the recovery evidence base. And so coming across both social identity theory, which struck me as a kind of useful conceptual framework for shaping some of this work, and then starting to engage with first William White and then Robert Granfield. And I'm really pleased to say we have a book coming out called the Recovery Capital Handbook next April, and Robert Granfield and William Cloud have written the first chapter for the book, and William White's written the introduction for it. So we have been able to tap back into but fundamentally, Wolf, the reason for starting this was twofold. One, it gave us a metric. It just gave us something we could count. Mm-hmm. And there was a political element to this that had occurred to me about 15 years ago. That if you use, so I was one of the authors of the Maudsley Addiction Profile, a traditional treatment outcome measure, no better or worse than any of the others, although much easier to score than the Addiction Severity Index, which I still don't really understand. Anyway, but the problem with those measures is they really work on the assumption, and it's an interesting assumption, that perfect treatment leaves you only asymptomatic. Because all they do is measure reductions in deficits. They basically say, what's wrong with you? We'll make a big list of what's wrong with you. We'll try and put all those things right so there's nothing wrong with you. And it strikes me, if you go to a TC or a 12-step group, the aim is something much more complex about belonging and human flourishing.
Yes.
Neither the Maudsley Addiction Profile nor the Addiction Severity Index will give you any indication of whether somebody's flourishing. Not because they're flawed, but because that's not their business. They're not interested. And so what does that mean? What that means is if you're a national treatment agency, or you're doing a Cochrane review, or you're the appalling OHID, essentially what you then do is to say, well, look, the outcomes we get from acute clinical services are much better than the outcomes we get from aftercare groups, therapeutic communities, recovery organisations, because that's not what they tried to do. So the second thing for me about Recovery Capital was, well, why don't we have a measure of what's above the line rather than just what's below the line? And incidentally, if we were to do Recovery Capital measurement in methadone maintenance clinics, I think we generally see the scores going down over time. We might see barriers and harms and acute risks improving. But I suspect, and certainly my experience of the dreadful methadone maintenance clinic in Camberwell was, people's quality of life frequently goes down. They're less likely to die. They're less likely to get arrested. They're less likely to get a bloodborne virus. But, in terms of well-being, not so good. Anyway, so that's the political part of it. For me, I wanted something that allowed us to be able to measure in a credible, meaningful way. And I was then lucky enough to, through Bill White, to start a series of communications with a woman called Alexandra Lodi. I don't know if that you remember. Again, somebody who's no longer involved in the field. And she'd done her and William White had done a great study about recovery in New York.
Yeah, no, I've read quite a lot of her work. Yeah,
absolutely. And not the easiest person to work with, but an incredibly bright, committed, passionate woman. And so we did in 2010, we did a brief kind of thought paper for the Royal Society for the Arts, who at that time were interested in recovery.
Yeah.
And we did, and it just started me thinking, how do we start to count this stuff? And since then, that's what, 14 years. A substantial part of my work really has been around developing, refining measures and metrics. And you ask, effectively, how do I keep kind of publications going? I should point out, Wolf, that I'm in 2025, I'll pass 250 peer-reviewed journal publications. So I have been able to keep that kind of that output.
You have, yeah, phenomenally, yeah.
That keeps those university paymasters from the door. But in the last decade, it really has been about measurement and metric. That's what I've been able to churn out.
But you're making you're making a really important point, even in doing that piece of work. I mean, I know we're going to try and extend the conversation, but at the heart of all of the conversations that we have had in this whole series so far, people are starting with one of those key points that you're making, that recovery is more than treatment. And this is exactly what you're saying. Treatment has a certain, and we could call it, yes, you're absolutely right, it's the deficit-based accounting. Is what I always used to say, that, well, if your life's shit and then, drinking makes it slightly less shit, and then you just get rid of the drinking, well, it's still shit. So, so you're absolutely right. So you're still making that same core point, even though you're doing it through this business of trying to capture or measure it into a system. Is this the point that there is something beyond treatment that's possibly more important to the individual and or of course life changing critically? Yes.